It's just after 5:30 in the evening. Inside the Sherry Netherland Hotel on Fifth Avenue, a 63-year-old man steps into the cloakroom. He sets down his briefcase. He takes out a piece of paper and begins to write. In his note, he calls his life a failure. The man who writes those words had once been worth $100 million. In today's money, that's somewhere around $1.5 billion. He had shorted the entire American stock market and won. He had been called the greatest trader who ever lived, and he had lost it all. This is the story of Jesse Livermore. And here's the thing, it's not just a story about money. It's a story about what happens when a brilliant mind refuses to master itself. Jesse Livermore was born in 1877 in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, a dirt-poor farming town. His father pulled him out of school at 14 to work the fields, but his mother had other ideas. She gave him $5, slipped it quietly into his hand, and told him to go, to leave, to find something better. And he did. He walked into the Boston office of Payne Webber and asked for a job. They hired him as a chalk boy, the kid who stood at a giant blackboard and wrote down stock prices as they came in over the wire. $5 a week, but Livermore wasn't just copying numbers. He was studying them. He began to notice patterns, the way prices moved before they moved further. He started writing them down in a notebook, testing theories, quietly, after hours, alone, within months. At just 14 years old, he made his first paper bet. Within a year, he had turned $5 into $1,000 trading in bucket shops, the illegal back-alley betting parlors of the era where you could bet on stock prices without actually owning any shares. The bucket shops eventually banned him. He was just too good. He had to wear disguises just to get in the door, so he moved to New York. Now, Wall Street in the early 1900s was a completely different animal. There were no computers, no Bloomberg terminals, no instant data. Getting accurate stock quotes required a small army of people. But in that chaos, Livermore found clarity. He had a gift, an almost eerie ability to read price patterns and anticipate what the market would do next. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't following tips. He had built, through thousands of hours of observation, a deep, intuitive model of how prices behave under different conditions. He would let her write, prices are never too high to begin buying, or too low to begin selling. And here's what he meant by that. The direction of the trend matters more than the absolute level of the price. A stock at a new high can go much higher. A stock in freefall can fall even further. The crowd's instinct to buy cheap and sell expensive was, he believed, usually dead wrong. His first major score came in 1906. A feeling, he called it a hunch. But it was really pattern recognition. Told him something was wrong with the Union Pacific Railroad. He shorted it. Days later, the San Francisco earthquake hit. The stock collapsed. Livermore walked away with $250,000. He was just 28 years old. But here's the thing about Jesse Livermore that his biographers always point to. The market didn't just give him money. It gave him money, then took it back, then gave it again, over and over. He went bust multiple times before the age of 30, not because he didn't know how to read markets, but because knowing the market and knowing yourself, well, those are two entirely different things. In 1907, America was on the edge of financial collapse. Banks were failing. Panic was spreading through the markets. Most traders were getting absolutely destroyed, but Livermore had been building short positions for weeks, convinced the market was headed for a cliff. His broker, a man named Ed Hutton, called him personally. He begged him to cover his shorts. The losses for other clients were catastrophic, and Livermore's positions were making it so much worse. Livermore refused. He had read the pattern. He knew exactly what was coming. By the time the 1907 panic had run its course, Jesse Livermore had made $1 million in a single day. That's the equivalent of tens of millions today. Get this, J.P. Morgan himself, the man orchestrating the bailout of their entire banking system, sent word to Livermore. He asked him, please stop shorting. You are making the panic worse. Livermore covered his positions, out of respect for Morgan, not because he had to. He was 30 years old and worth more money than he had ever imagined. He moved into a palatial office on Fifth Avenue with mahogany paneling he had shipped from an English manor house. Rolls Royces, a yacht, a private rail car. He had cracked the code, or so he thought. The years between 1907 and 1929 were a study in contradiction. Livermore made fortunes, lost them, made them all over again. He went bankrupt twice, in 1908 and again in 1915, and each time he had broken his own rules. He'd traded on tips. He'd averaged down on losing positions. He'd let raw emotion override logic. Now, here's one of his most famous moments. In the late 1910s, he cornered the cotton market, buying so much cotton that he could theoretically control the entire price. President Woodrow Wilson had him brought to the White House. The president asked him to stand down. Livermore agreed, on one condition, that he could exit at break-even. Wilson agreed, when asked afterward why he had done it. Livermore reportedly said, "To see if I could, Mr. President, and that, right there, tells you everything about the man. The market wasn't just income, it was the game, the ultimate test of mind against the world. But that mindset, that burning need to prove, to dominate, to be the biggest force in the room, would eventually consume him by the late 1920s. America was completely drunk on the stock market. The Dow had risen fivefold in just 6 years. Ordinary people, secretaries, taxi drivers, teachers, were buying stocks on margin, putting down as little as 10% of the price. The total margin debt across the country had ballooned to $8.5 billion. That's more than the total dollars in circulation at the time. Most people saw this as a golden age, but Livermore, he saw something else entirely. He began building short positions in early 1929, quietly, using more than 100 different brokers to hide exactly what he was doing. By spring, he was down over $6 million on paper. The market kept rising. People around him thought he had absolutely lost his mind, but he held. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the market cracked. Over the following days, it didn't just fall, it collapsed. By 1932, the Dow had lost 89% of its value. Jesse Livermore's short position paid off beyond any reasonable expectation. By the time he covered his shorts, he had made $100 million. He walked home that night. His wife was waiting. She had heard the news on the radio. She thought she knew what he would say. He told her they were worth $100 million. She burst into tears, not from joy, from relief, and maybe from something else, because she knew her husband. She knew what happened to Jesse Livermore when the game was over. The newspapers called him the Great Bear of Wall Street. Some called him the Wolf. People blamed him for the crash. Death threats arrived daily. He had to hire bodyguards. He had $100 million. He had beaten the greatest market in history. He had nothing left to prove. So, he went back in. He began trading again in the early 1930s, the worst possible environment for a leveraged long trader. The rules that had made him famous, following trends, cutting losses fast, never averaging down, he abandoned them all. He ignored his own system. He started listening to others. He added to losing positions, convinced the recovery was just around the corner. By 1934, just 5 years after the greatest trade of his career, Jesse Livermore was bankrupt for the third time. He listed assets of $84,000 against debts of $2.5 million. He spent the last years of his life writing. His book, How to Trade in Stocks, published in 1940, was a sincere attempt to codify everything he had learned about markets, about patience, about what the human mind does under intense pressure. It didn't sell well. The world was at war. Nobody cared about stock tips. On November 28, 1940, a cold Thursday evening in New York, Jesse Livermore walked into the Sherry Netherland Hotel. He ordered a scotch. He sat alone for a while. Then he stepped into the cloakroom. Police found him there. In his pocket, a note to his wife, 8 pages long. At the bottom, the last line read, "My life has been a failure." Jesse Livermore was perhaps the most talented market reader who ever lived, and yet he is remembered as much for his destruction as for his genius. Why? Because he solved the outer problem, how to read the market, but he never fully solved the inner one, how to read himself. He knew the rules, He had written them down, he taught them to others, and yet, under enough pressure, under enough loss or enough success, those rules simply dissolved. The very instincts that made him great, the boldness, the conviction, the willingness to bet everything, were the same instincts that, left uncontrolled, destroyed him. He wrote near the end of his life, "The game of speculation is the most uniformly fascinating game in the world, but it is not a game for the stupid, the mentally lazy, the man of inferior emotional balance, or for the get-rich-quick adventurer. They will die poor." He was not stupid. He was not mentally lazy, but emotional balance, the ability to stay consistent when everything in your body is screaming otherwise. That was his war. And make no mistake, it is every trader's war. There's a reason traders still read reminiscences of a stock operator 100 years after it was written. Not because the charts haven't changed, everything has changed, but because the human being staring at those charts has not changed at all. Livermore's life is the clearest possible demonstration of the most important truth in trading. You can be right about the market and still lose everything. The real edge is not information, it is self-mastery.